In Alexander's Pope, The Rape of the Lock, there is a line few native speakers of English can grasp on first reading. Gainst Palace, Mars, Latona, Herm's arms. What do we make of such a line, which is punctuated as a self contained unit of thought? And why does it occur in the work of a poet renowned of his elegance and clarity of expression? The answer, or at least one answer, is that Pope is using poetic syntax to mimic the hurried confusion that soldiers experience in battle, describing a moment when two pairs of Greek gods are arming themselves to fight each other, as related in Homer's Iliad. Adapt, Pope adapts a classic syntactic pattern with the Greek name zeugma. For his own poetic purposes, zeugma occurs when a single verb governs several parallel words or clauses, verbal units discussed below on page 2056, using a pattern that some but not all of his English speaking readers would have recognized. Pope makes a densely compressed line that slows any reader down, impeding easy comprehension, but perhaps that is part of Pope's aim as he constructs a linguistic analog for certain aspects of the imagined battle scene. In so doing, Pope uses syntax not only to communicate ideas but also to create certain dramatic and meaningful effects by the very structure of his lines. What is syntax? Syntax has been defined in many ways. We can begin our own inquiry into the theory and various historical practices of poetic syntax by saying that it concerns transactions between poets and their audiences, readers and listeners, about the meanings of certain sequences of words. The meanings emerge as words unroll in time and also if we are reading the poem in space. But meaning is also a function of how words and groups of words hark back to earlier ones, sometimes with the effect of suspending or even contesting time's forward motion. The word syntax, from the Greek words syn to gather and tax to arrange, denotes the orderly or systematic arrangements of parts or elements. At the most general level, these elements involve symbols, including mathematical ones, that are arranged to create propositions or statements. The symbols that matter most for poetic syntax are words and a group and groups of words, but punctuation marks, line, shapes, stanza forms, metrical schemes, and rhyme patterns are also important for understanding poetic syntax as an arrangement of words that generate meaningful statements. When we are discussing poetry, syntax may refer either to actual arrangements of words or to rules of grammar and conventions of word order that are reflected, but also sometimes challenged in such arrangements. We usually think of rules as governing behavior and syntactic rules to govern the behavior of statements in various languages. In the domain of poetry, however, notions about governance, obedience, and order often exist in counterpoint to notions about the aesthetic as well as the social values of certain kinds of unruliness, those traditionally discussed under the rubric of poetic license. Poetic syntax, therefore, is a slippery and even in some ways a contradictory topic. For while we are thinking about syntax as an orderly arrangement of verbal elements according to the conventions of a particular language, we also need to be thinking about poetic syntax as a making of significant disorder within a language and often with allusions to other languages and the rules or practices of syntax. We can highlight a paradox inherent in any attempt to define poetic syntax by comparing poetic syntax to a game with complex rules that include, under certain circumstances, the option to break the rules. Poets have played the syntactic game for a long time, often in competition with each other as well as with real and imagined audiences. In this game, some syntactic rules have changed, but many retain signs of the close historical links between English and Latin, two very different languages that nonetheless share many words as well as many ways of defining what constitutes syntactical correctness. For students of poetic syntax, the most important difference between English and Latin is that in English, Meaning depends on certain words being neighbors to one another. Whereas in Latin, proximity and distance between words matter little for understanding most written statements. In Latin, a highly inflected language, endings of words, suffixes tell us a great deal about which words in a given statement to go with which other words. The endings of nouns, adjectives, and verbs change, are inflected. According to the function in a given statement, English is a much less inflected language, although certain words need to agree with each other, as is true in Latin and many other languages too. Singular nouns take singular verbs. For instance, in English, however, the most important determinant of meaning is the order of words, individually or in groups. The contrast can be summed up this way. In Latin, you can tell your friend that she has hit the nail on the head by saying remacu teti gisti or teti gisti rem. But in English, you cannot perform the same linguistic operation without severe semantic consequences. There is a considerable difference between saying that you hit the nail and saying that the nail hit you. Poets in English play incessantly with normal patterns of word order, thus creating a multitude of interesting, witty, logical, subtle, and often surprising effects, requiring us to ponder parallels between words and groups of words, sometimes more widely separated from each other than they would be in an ordinary prose statement. Some poets in English use syntactic arrangements in ways that challenge the reader's expectations about word order. Alternatively or additionally, some poets build sentences with multiple parts from parts more complexly related to each other than they would be in most modern English speech or writing. To participate in the syntactic games poets typically play, we need some shared terms for describing the elements that poets arrange in orderly but also apparently disorderly fashion. Parts of syntax, sentences, and words. The first rule of poetic game of syntax, as it is represented in an anthology like this one, which includes a wide range of poems written at many times in many forms of English, is that most poets use the grammatical unit called the sentence as a major unit of meaning, along with, but often in counterpoint to, the unit of the poetic line or the unit of the stanza. See versification. The sentence is the largest meaning bearing unit of syntax, while the word the smallest. Neither unit can be easily defined. This is so because both sentences and words can be compounded and divided in various ways that become more complex the more closely we look at them across the arc of history. Because English has changed so much over time. In other words, we can't safely assume that modern rules apply in centuries old texts as best we can. We need to bring history into our readings. Sentences are sometimes defined as units that have subjects and predicates. In the simplest cases, a noun, subject, and a predicate consisting only of a verb Jill runs. In the most common type of English sentence, a noun working as a subject is followed by a verb which leads to and conceptually affects acts on a noun which may or may not be modified and which is called a direct object. The bird eats the worm, or more elaborately, Edwin Muir's The grasses threw straight shadows far away. In a second very common sentence type, the subject is followed by a predicate that complements, refers back